my first example, I considered reckless driving. In my second example, I considered murder. In my third example, I'd like to consider adultery. In this example, I wish to speak to any viewer who believes that ethical principles come from divine revelation. But in order to make the example specific, I'd like to speak to a Christian who is married. For the purpose of this example, then, I'm speaking to a married Christian who believes that the reason he or she doesn't commit adultery is that divine revelation reveals that God doesn't approve of adultery. The original source of such a notion is the commandment against adultery in the Old Testament. And the New Testament contains statements that corroborate the Old Testament injunction. I wish to pose for this Christian a scenario and a question. Let's suppose that instead of giving us the Bible, God gave us a book that conveys nothing about ethical values pertaining to adultery. Now here's my question. In this scenario, would you feel free to commit adultery? And would you feel inclined to commit adultery? I invite you to pause the video on the next slide and think deeply about the question, and then answer the question and explain your answer. I believe that nearly everyone will answer the question in the negative, and that the remaining people will be people who don't develop deep, committed, long-standing relations. Why do I believe this? Because most people do develop deep, committed, long-standing relations, and they cherish those relations. Their most important relation is their marriage, and they realize that if they were to commit adultery, it would violate their unique relation of personal and sexual intimacy with their spouse. If they were to commit adultery, it would demote the significance of their spouse as a unique individual whom they cherish and to whom they are committed. The resulting degradation in their marriage would also degrade their family life with detrimental results for their children. Corroborating this insight, keep in mind that the Old Testament society, in which the commandment against adultery was given, allowed a man to have concubines and multiple wives. But when we read the commandment today, we read it in terms of strict monogamy. Why? Did we need God to tell us that too? Of course not. The intuitive reason for strict monogamy is quite simple. It produces higher quality marital relations. We further observe that marriage is a universal institution in all cultures throughout recorded history, confirming our deduction that the origin of marriage is not divine revelation in the Bible. Rather, the reason for the injunction against adultery is that it presents the highest standard for relational quality. By itself, of course, the injunction does not guarantee a high-quality relation, but it establishes a basic principle that is necessary for the highest quality relation. Given this insight, which reflects the wisdom of the ages, religious leaders then claim that the respective behaviors mandated by divine commands, thereby imbuing such insight with the highest possible attribution, namely, that of divine origin. In Western civilization prior to the time of Christ, the Jews set the highest ethical standard. Then, in the decades following the death of Jesus, the Apostle Paul carried this Judaic ethical standard to the Mediterranean world through his cosmopolitan version of Judaism, which is centered on Jesus as the Messiah or Christ. Finally, suppose that a man or a woman goes through life avoiding adultery in order to obtain divine approval, rather than in order to honor their spouse and to cultivate the highest quality relation with their spouse. This constitutes a perpetual state of immaturity. To use an analogy, it's like a child who never grows up, continuing to shun theft, for example, not for the resulting benefit to relevant parties, but because mommy or daddy inculcated the value of not stealing. In general, the idea that the origin of ethical principles is God constitutes an immature approach to ethics. The mature approach is to understand the benefits that ethical principles bring to relations and to follow ethical principles in order to realize these benefits. Let's briefly summarize. I mentioned that I begin my book by establishing that all knowledge is the result of reason applied to experience, where experience encompasses all human experience. I then presented 3 examples to illustrate that our ethical principles are based on reason applied to experience. The first example pertained to reckless driving. The second example pertained to murder. And the third example pertained to adultery. So where do ethical principles come from? They come from reason applied to experience. Please keep in mind, as I said in the intro video, that my book is filled with painstaking analysis of all of the issues, and that in these short videos I can present only highlights. Having established that ethical principles are based on reason applied to experience, we're bound to ask how to create such principles. That is, we're bound to ask how to develop ethical principles based on reason applied to experience. We'll see how in our next video.